Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the difference between volume and progressive overload and their relationship to muscle gains, because this can get pretty complex and confusing for people. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this, because I did have a subscriber say, hey, I was running one of your linear programs, and I was looking at my numbers, because you were talking the other day about tonnage, and total tonnage done is actually an important factor for muscle growth, that the data supports it. There's actually good research out there showing that basically the total workload that you do absolutely affects the amount of muscle growth you induce. There's a pretty strong correlation between the two. So I was confused because some of the later weeks, the more intense blocks in the program of yours, that I was moving less tonnage. So how does that stimulate more growth? I'm confused. You know what? That's a fantastic question. That's a fantastic question, because he's right. There are going to be points, even in linear progression, like block periodization even, where you're going to have weeks even later in a program where you're pushing towards overreaching to where your tonnage is lower. And that can create some confusion there. And when we talk about total tonnage mean, that's what I was talking about with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's work. The research that he showed that when tonnage was equal, that 3 rep sets produced as much muscle growth as 10 rep sets did. Meaning when something like 7 sets of 3 with a heavier weight are done versus 3 sets of 10, so 21 total reps spread over 7 sets versus 30 reps with a slightly lighter weight spread over 3 sets, when the tonnage was equal between the two, and done over weeks and months, when they measure it, the muscle growth was the same, which is interesting. And there is something to be said for that. There does seem to be a correlation between tonnage and muscle growth, but there is also somewhat of a correlation between weight used on the bar and maximum strength. And he noticed in that study that the 7 sets of 3 with the heavier weight produced more strength increases on the 1 rep maxes on those exercises, while giving similar muscle gains. Meaning there's a relationship between size and strength, but it isn't perfect, because there's also a neurological component to strength. And that's where we get into some of that, because there are going to be weeks on various programs where you don't increase tonnage, but you still get stronger, and strength still can equal size. And that's an interesting thing to look at. Because, when we look at progressive overload, the understanding is that progressive overload, and again, you guys know, I've told the story of Milo of Croton in the bull multiple times. You guys know the idea there, that by gradually increasing the weight that you use over the course of months or years, you get bigger and you get stronger. This has been understood for 2,500 years. The Greek philosophers figured this out. The ancient Greeks figured this out, among all the other things that they learned about mathematics and everything. They were pretty smart people. They came up with a lot of modern concepts that we still use today in mathematics, and they came up with progressive overload with the story of Milo of Croton, which we don't know if it's a true story or not. But the Greek philosophers still talked about it. And that's the whole point. Progressive overload equals more size and strength. But what we have learned is that total tonnage does affect the amount of muscle growth you induce, not necessarily if you grow or not. And what I mean is, if you were to use a given amount of tonnage, doing more tonnage at a given size will generally produce slightly more muscle growth. Now, you're not going to double your tonnage and double your muscle growth, but if you're producing X amount of tonnage, you're moving so many tons with an exercise through a given range of motion and whatever, you're going to grow from it if it's progressive overload. But if you increase that tonnage 50% or even 100%, you go from moving whatever your 30 tons up to 45 tons or 60 tons. All right? You're going to gain a little more muscle from it. It is going to be more muscle. It's not going to be double. It might only be a 5% increase. But you know what? People who are chasing a lot of muscle growth, gaining 5% more muscle off of one type of workout over another, is something a lot of people will put in extra work to get. Nature of the game. Some people are willing to work harder than others for just a little bit of extra. And that's okay. That's what everyone has to decide for themselves, how much work you're willing to put in and how important a goal is to you. That's a very individual thing. But here's the thing. If you use the same tonnage without changing any variables for long enough, you won't grow on it anymore. That's what people need to understand. When we talk about progressive overload means you use more work. You subject a muscle to more work over time than you have previously done with it, and it will adapt. The human body, and that includes muscles, bones, and nervous system, everything else, will adapt to work over time. It is the progression itself that fuels muscle growth, fuels if you make muscle growth or not. Tonnage can be a factor in how much muscle growth. But overload can be comprised of a lot of different things. Because that's a very simple term, isn't it? Overload, we just say if you do more work. But what does that mean? That can mean a lot of different things. And here's what all that can mean. You want to know what's more work? Lift more weight. If you lift a heavier weight than you've previously lifted on a given exercise with the same form and the same bar tempo, meaning the same amount of microseconds to lift it through the same number of inches, the same range of motion, that is progressive overload. You've subjected the muscle to more tension than you've previously subjected it to. Your body will adapt to that. It will adapt to a new stimulus. Because that's what it comes down to, adapting to training stimulus. Subjecting your body to something it hasn't experienced before to make your body realize it needs to make a change to adapt to what you're subjecting it to, particularly when you subject it to it several times. Body doesn't always respond to a single time stimulus. That's what you need to remember. It can sometimes respond more to the second or third time you subject it to a stimulus because it becomes chronic. It realizes you're going to keep doing this over and over. But there's more than that to progressive overload. Progressive overload could also mean doing more reps. Taking X amount of weight, Y amount of reps, and increasing the reps. Is that a new training stimulus? If you've lifted a given amount of weight for 6 reps, and that's the most you've ever lifted it for, and one day you're able to do 7, or you eventually get to 8, is that more work? Yes, that's more work. All right, that is more work. What about more overall volume? What if you had more sets? What if you've only done 3 sets of 8 ever with a given weight, and you come in and do 4 sets of 8 one day? Or you even only get to 5 or 6 reps on the 4th set, but you've added another set more than you've ever done. Is that more work? Of course it is. What if you come in and you move a weight slightly faster than you've ever moved it before? That recruits muscle fibers differently. That's a new workload. What if you move that same amount of weight for the same amount of reps, but you're a little more explosive and faster? Recruits more upper threshold fibers. You subjected it to more work. Those are all forms of progressive overload. They all have different adaptations in the body. Some of them are more neurological. Some of them are more structural, meaning they make tissue proteins thicker. Some of them train the nervous system better, but ultimately, they're all going to make you grow. Now, tonnage, the thing is, your tonnage is going to be limited by strength, meaning someone who can max 500 pounds on an exercise is capable of doing twice the tonnage that someone else can do who can only max 250, right? They're twice as strong. They can stimulate twice the tonnage with the same number of sets and same number of reps. Because if you put something like 400 pounds on the bar, they're going to do a lot more reps than 400 pounds than the guy who lifts 250 does with 200, aren't they? What about when you start doing multiple sets with that? They're going to end up racking up twice the tonnage really, really fast. So there is a strength component. So what I would point out when you're talking about block periodization, people need to understand that just increasing tonnage with high reps and moderate weight has a certain threshold to where it starts slowing down real quick. So a lot of times block periodization, you will add reps and sets as you go, but you're going to reach a threshold where more volume done that way just doesn't stimulate new growth. Now you're going to get a lot of growth. When you're doing 3 sets of 10, then you go to 4 sets of 10, and then 5 sets of 10. That's an enormous amount of volume no matter what your max is. That's a lot of volume. You're going to stimulate probably the most muscle growth you're going to get through most of block periodization unless you're doing really, really high sets with heavier weight, right? We go back and look at that tonnage experiment that Dr. Brad Schoenfeld did. But there are finite limits. When you keep adding sets and reps, at a certain point, it just doesn't keep adding as much muscle as you'd like, and sometimes it really stalls. So the reason you run these blocks is that you go heavier and heavier and add volume with heavier weights each time you reset the weight. Eventually, you're going to have less tonnage. But when you go down to 5 rep sets, if you've been doing 10 rep sets before, and you get stronger with your 5 rep sets, yes, it's less tonnage. It might not stimulate as much new muscle growth as those really high reps did. Particularly if you're doing 3 sets of 5, let's be honest, 3 sets of 5 is not going to have as much tonnage as 5 sets of 10 is. It's not. No matter how strong you are, you're going to move a lot more tonnage. But the 3 sets of 5 is going to give you a little more strength. It's going to train neuromuscular efficiency a little bit more. If you're running blocks of periodization, you're going to stall after a few weeks on each style of training, and that's why you change it every 3 weeks in a systemized process. And by doing that, you adapt to the new training stimulus. But when you go to the sets of 5 and you end up getting stronger as a result of that, maybe you don't gain as much muscle as you did in those 10 and 8 rep weeks. You're going to gain muscle still, just not as much. But you're going to gain more neuromuscular efficiency. You're going to get stronger. You're going to increase your maxes. You're going to increase your work capacity. So what happens when you go back a few weeks later, you rotate back over to the higher rep sets, what happens? You're now stronger. You might be able to lift 5 more pounds. Some cases, 10 more pounds for your 3 sets of 10. So if you've been doing 200 pounds for 3 sets of 10 and now you're strong enough to do 210 pounds for 3 sets of 10, you've increased your total tonnage by 5%. You're now subjecting your body to 5% more work than it's ever had to do. You're going to grow from that. And that's the whole point. People need to understand when it comes to periodization like that, it's not about getting maximum tonnage to every block. It's about training to maximum recoverable volume and adapting to different training stimulus so that you get all around bigger and stronger. So that the performance carryover from block to block to block carries over so that every time you run through the series and say the 12-week set of blocks, like you run 4 different blocks in 3-week sets, every 12 weeks when you come back and repeat it, you're better than you were the 12 weeks before. Your tonnages and your workloads go up. You're adding progressive overload to it. And as a result of that, you're going to continue to get bigger and stronger. And you don't generally stall. If you program this stuff correctly, you very rarely hit stalls because you're adapting the programming to where stalls tend to happen in people in the way they adapt and recover. So the whole point that people need to understand here is that progressive overload is the primary driving factor, and that's through progressive workload of any type of extra work. It can be volume, tonnage, metabolic fatigue, tension, and tension is, of course, weight, intensity. There are different factors involved in progressive overload. All of them make you bigger. The tonnage itself can be a determining factor in how much growth you stimulate at any given time. So there's a relationship between the two, but they are two slightly different things. But you need to remember, you don't always have to increase your tonnage week to week in order to get bigger and to get stronger. You just have to progress on the overload. But just remember that the tonnage can be a factor in how much muscle growth you get in that time, because volume actually does affect how much you grow. It is an important factor, but it is not the only factor. It just ranks up near the top. It's possibly one of the most important factors. Progressive overload determines if you're going to grow or not. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.